Sometimes the weight of loss can crush a man's spirit until he can barely breathe. Daniel knew that feeling well. 6 months after burying his wife, he could barely look his 9-year-old son Max in the eye without seeing everything they'd both lost. He planned one final hiking trip in the remote highlands of Eastern Europe before moving in with his estranged father. It was meant to be their last adventure together, a chance to say goodbye to the dreams they once shared. But when Max chased a glowing butterfly into a hidden canyon, they discovered something impossible. A perfectly preserved medieval city, untouched by time and missing from every map. Built into the cliffsides and covered in centuries of moss, this forgotten place held secrets worth over $140 million. But what happens when a desperate father and his son find a treasure that was never meant to be discovered before? We jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Daniel Morrison had always believed that buildings could tell stories. As an architect, he'd spent 15 years listening to the whispers of brick and mortar, understanding how spaces shaped the people who inhabited them. But after Sarah's funeral, even his own home had fallen silent. The Victorian duplex in Chicago that had once echoed with laughter now felt like a mausoleum, every corner holding memories too painful to bear. The medical bills had arrived like vultures after the burial, picking clean what remained of their savings. Sarah's 2-year battle with cancer had drained not only their bank account, but Daniel's ability to design anything beautiful. His last 3 projects had been rejected by clients who complained his work lacked vision and hope. How could he explained that hope had died in a sterile hospital room on a Tuesday morning in February. Max had stopped talking much after the funeral. At 9 years old, he possessed an intelligence that sometimes unnerved adults, asking questions that cut straight to the heart of complicated truths. But lately, he'd retreated into books about explorers and ancient civilizations, as if searching for something in those pages that the modern world couldn't provide. Daniel watched his son disappear a little more each day, and felt helpless to bridge the growing chasm between them. The decision to visit Eastern Europe had been born from desperation rather than wanderlust. Daniel's father, Robert, had called from his retirement home in Milwaukee with an offer that felt more like a life preserver than a choice. "Come stay with me," the old man had said, his voice carrying decades of unresolved tension. "Sell the house. Let me help with Max. You can't do this alone anymore." The admission of defeat tasted bitter, but Daniel knew his father was right. He couldn't afford the mortgage payments much longer, and Max needed stability that Daniel seemed incapable of providing. Before surrendering to that reality, however, he decided on one final adventure, a hiking trip through the Carpathian Mountains, following a route Sarah had marked in their old travel guides years ago when she still believed they'd have time for all their dreams. "Why Romania?" Max had asked when Daniel presented the plan, the first full sentence his son had spoken in weeks. "Your mother wanted to see the medieval castles," Daniel had replied, watching Max's face carefully. "She said there were stories hiding in those mountains that nobody had found yet." Max had nodded slowly, and for the first time since the funeral, Daniel had seen a flicker of the curious boy who used to spend hours building elaborate castles from blocks and asking endless questions about how ancient people lived. The flight to Bucharest had been Max's first time leaving North America. He'd pressed his face to the window during descent, watching the patchwork of forests and mountains unfold below them like an illustration from one of his adventure books. Daniel had rented a sturdy SUV and loaded it with camping gear, determined to spend a week in the wilderness before returning to face the practical realities of packing up their life. The drive north from the capital had taken them through villages that seemed untouched by the 21st century. Stone churches with weathered spires dotted hillsides where shepherds still guided flocks along ancient paths. Max had come alive during these drives, pointing out architectural details he'd learned from his books and asking Daniel to explain the engineering behind medieval bridge construction. Their base camp was established near a trailhead, marked only by a weathered wooden sign that read Pietra Ascunsa, hidden stone. The local ranger station had provided maps of marked trails, but Daniel had been drawn to the dotted lines indicating unmarked paths that wound deeper into the mountain range. Sarah had always said that the best discoveries came from leaving the beaten path. On their third morning, they'd packed light day packs with water, energy bars, and Max's ever-present journal. The unmarked trail began gently enough, winding through dense pine forests where morning mist clung to the ground like ghostly fingers. Max had been unusually chatty, sharing facts about medieval trade routes and asking Daniel to identify different architectural styles they might encounter in ruins. "Dad, did you know that some medieval cities were built in places so remote that cartographers never found them?" Max had said, scrambling over a fallen log with the agility that only children possess. They could disappear from history completely. Daniel had smiled, the first genuine smile he could remember since Sarah's death. Is that so? And what happened to the people in those cities? Some books say they found ways to preserve their knowledge and wait for the right people to discover them again, Max had replied, with the matter-of-fact tone he used when discussing his theories. Like they were guardians of something important. The trail had grown more challenging as they climbed higher, requiring careful navigation around rocky outcroppings and across streams swollen with snowmelt. Daniel had found himself breathing hard, realizing how much the months of grief and neglected self-care had affected his physical condition. But Max had seemed energized by the climb, pausing frequently to examine interesting rock formations or collect smooth stones for his growing collection. It was during one of these pauses that they'd first noticed the butterfly. Unlike the common mountain species they'd observed earlier, this creature seemed to pulse with an inner light, its wings shifting between deep blue and silver as it danced around Max's head. Daniel had initially dismissed it as a trick of the afternoon light filtering through the forest canopy, but Max had been transfixed. "It's beautiful," Max had whispered, extending his hand toward the creature. The butterfly had settled briefly on his palm, and Daniel could have sworn he saw actual luminescence emanating from its wings. When the butterfly had lifted off and begun flying deeper into the forest, away from their marked trail, Max had looked at his father with an expression Daniel hadn't seen since before Sarah's illness. Pure, unadulterated wonder. "Can we follow it, Dad? Just for a little while?" Every parental instinct had warned against leaving the established path, but something in Max's voice, a note of hope that had been absent for months, had made Daniel nod. "Stay close to me, and if we lose sight of the trail markers, we turn back immediately." The butterfly had led them through increasingly dense forest, along what appeared to be an ancient path marked by stones worn smooth by centuries of weather. The air had grown cooler and more humid as they descended into a narrow canyon Daniel couldn't find on any of their maps. Towering walls of limestone rose on either side, creating a natural corridor that muffled sound and made their footsteps echo strangely. Max had walked ahead, following the butterfly with single-minded determination, while Daniel tried to maintain his bearings and remember landmarks for their return journey. The canyon had curved and twisted, creating the sensation of descending into the earth itself. Patches of moss and lichen covered the rock walls, and Daniel had begun to notice carved symbols, worn almost smooth but still visible, that suggested human presence in ages past. "Dad, look at this!" Max had called from around the next bend, his voice carrying an excitement that made Daniel's heart race with anticipation and concern. When Daniel had caught up with his son, he'd found Max standing at the edge of a circular, clearing where the canyon opened into a natural amphitheater. But it was what rose from the far side of the clearing that had stolen Daniel's breath and changed everything they thought they knew about the world. Built into the limestone cliffs like something from a fairy tale, a medieval city stretched upward, in impossible defiance of time and gravity. Towers and battlements emerged from the living rock, their stones so perfectly fitted that no mortar was visible. Moss and vines had claimed portions of the walls, but rather than suggesting decay, they seemed to breathe life into the ancient construction. A massive gate stood open at ground level, flanked by carved figures that appeared to be guardians or sentinels. Above the gate, carved into the keystone arch, was an intricate compass, rose unlike any Daniel had ever seen. Instead of pointing to cardinal directions, its arms seemed to indicate different scenes: a plague-ravaged village, a prosperous marketplace, a battle scene, a peaceful harvest. The workmanship was extraordinary, suggesting craftsmen of exceptional skill and artistic vision. Max had been the first to break the stunned silence. "It's real, isn't it, Dad?" "It's actually real." Daniel had nodded slowly, his architect's mind struggling to process what he was seeing. The engineering required to carve living spaces from solid rock, the precision of the stonework, the advanced understanding of structural support. All of it spoke to a level of medieval craftsmanship that challenged everything he'd learned about. Historical construction techniques. The glowing butterfly had settled on the compass rose carving, its wings pulsing gently as if in recognition or greeting. Then it had lifted off and disappeared through the open gate, leaving father and son standing at the threshold of the impossible. "Should we go in?" Max had asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Daniel had looked at his son, really looked at him, and seen something he'd feared was gone forever. Max's eyes were bright with curiosity and wonder, his whole body vibrating with excitement and possibility. For the first time in months, his son looked truly alive. Taking Max's hand in his own, Daniel had stepped forward toward the ancient gate, not knowing that this single decision would transform them both in ways that would echo through generations. Yet to come, stepping through the ancient gate felt like crossing the threshold between worlds. The air inside the city carried a different quality, cooler, tinged with the scent of old stone, and something else Daniel couldn't identify. Herbs, perhaps, or incense that had long since faded but left its essence embedded in the very walls. The main square opened before them, paved with stones fitted so perfectly that grass grew only in deliberate patterns between them, creating natural pathways that guided the eye toward different areas of the city. Buildings rose on all sides, their facades carved directly from the cliff face but designed with such architectural sophistication that they seemed to have grown naturally from the rock rather than been hewn from it. Max released his father's hand and wandered toward the center of the square, where a circular well was topped by an ornate iron framework. The metalwork depicted scenes of daily medieval life: farmers tending crops, craftsmen at their benches, children playing games that looked remarkably similar to ones Max enjoyed. Daniel noticed that despite the apparent age of everything around them, there was no sense of abandonment or decay. The city felt expectant, as if it had been waiting. "Dad, these buildings are incredible," Max called out, running his hands along the smooth stone walls. "Look at how they integrated the natural cave formations into the architecture. It's like they understood the mountain itself." Daniel nodded, his professional admiration growing with each detail he observed. The engineering was beyond anything he'd seen in his studies of medieval construction. Water channels carved into the stone directed rainwater into collection systems. Window openings were positioned to maximize natural light while maintaining structural integrity. Every element served both functional and aesthetic purposes with an elegance that spoke to master craftsmen. They explored methodically, Max documenting everything in his journal while Daniel tried to understand the principles behind the construction. The residential areas featured multi-level dwellings connected by stairs carved directly into the rock face. A large hall that might have served as a community gathering place retained traces of colorful murals on its walls, depicting scenes of prosperity and celebration. But it was the bell tower that ultimately captured Max's attention. Rising from the far end of the square, it stretched higher than any other structure in the city, its silhouette visible against the patch of sky framed by the canyon walls above. Unlike the other buildings, the tower seemed to call to Max specifically, drawing him forward with an inexplicable magnetism. "Can we go up there?" Max asked, pointing toward the tower's entrance. Daniel examined the structure carefully. The stonework appeared solid, and a spiral staircase was clearly visible through the open doorway. "We'll go together, and we take it slowly. These stairs have been here for centuries." The climb was easier than Daniel had expected. The steps, though worn smooth by age, were perfectly proportioned and showed no signs of structural weakness. Windows at regular intervals provided both light and views of the city below, allowing them to rest and appreciate the full scope of the settlement they'd discovered. At the top of the tower, they found a chamber that took Daniel's breath away. The room was circular, with large openings facing in each direction, providing panoramic views of the hidden valley. But it was the mechanism at the center of the chamber that captured their immediate attention. Constructed from a combination of metal, stone, and what appeared to be crystal components, the device resembled a cross between a clock and an astrolabe. Intricate gears and wheels were arranged around a central hub, with symbols and markings that seemed to correspond to celestial movements. The craftsmanship was extraordinary, suggesting knowledge of both mechanical engineering and astronomy. That challenged everything Daniel thought he knew about medieval technology. Max approached the mechanism with the fearless curiosity that only children possess. "It's some kind of calculator, isn't it? Look at these symbols. They match the ones on the compass rose at the gate." Daniel studied the device more carefully, noting how certain components seemed designed to be manipulated. There were levers and dials that appeared to control different aspects of the mechanism, though their exact purpose remained mysterious. The metal components showed no signs of rust or corrosion, despite the apparent age of the construction. "Be careful, Max. We don't know what this does or how fragile it might be." But Max was already examining a series of crystal lenses arranged around the mechanism's perimeter. As he shifted one of the lenses to catch the afternoon light streaming through the eastern window, something remarkable happened. The entire mechanism began to resonate with a low musical hum that seemed to vibrate through the stone floor beneath their feet. Daniel reached out to pull Max away from the device, but his son was transfixed by what was happening. The crystal components began to emit a soft, pulsing light that matched the rhythm of the humming sound. Gears that had been motionless for centuries started to turn slowly, their movements synchronized with mathematical precision. The sound grew stronger, not louder but deeper, as if the entire city were responding to the mechanism's activation. Through the tower windows, Daniel could see lights beginning to flicker in windows throughout the settlement. Not fires or torches, but the same gentle luminescence that emanated from the mechanism itself. Then, with a sound like a massive stone, grinding open, something shifted beneath the city's main square. Daniel watched in amazement as a section of the paved courtyard slid aside, revealing stairs that descended into darkness below the surface. The movement was so smooth and precise that it had clearly been designed for exactly this purpose. "Max, step away from that thing," Daniel said, though his voice carried wonder rather than concern. Max looked up at his father, his eyes bright with excitement. "Dad, I think we just unlocked something. Look at the city. It's coming alive." Indeed, the entire settlement seemed to be awakening. The gentle lights in the windows grew steadier, and Daniel could hear the sound of water beginning to flow through channels that had been silent moments before. The very air seemed to shimmer with possibility. They descended from the tower and approached the newly revealed entrance in the square. The stairs were wide enough for two people to walk comfortably side by side, carved from the same stone as the rest of the city but polished to a mirror finish. The walls were lined with more of the crystal components they'd seen in the tower mechanism, providing soft illumination that made the descent feel welcoming rather than ominous. The stairs ended at a circular chamber that took Daniel's breath away. They stood in what could only be described as a vault, but unlike any treasury he'd ever imagined. The walls were lined with alcoves containing objects that seemed to glow with their own inner light. Gold coins, jewelry, ceremonial weapons, and artifacts whose purposes Daniel could only guess at filled every available space, but it was the far wall of the chamber that held their greatest surprise. There, displayed on a pedestal of white marble, sat a crown unlike anything Daniel had ever seen. Its design was elegant rather than ostentatious, incorporating precious stones in patterns that seemed to shift and change as they watched. Beside the crown lay a collection of documents, their parchment perfectly preserved despite their obvious age. Max approached the documents with characteristic curiosity, though he was careful not to touch them. "Dad, I can read some of this. It's Latin, but there are phrases in other languages too. This one looks like it might be a deed or charter of some kind." Daniel joined his son and immediately recognized the significance of what they were seeing. The documents were legal instruments, written in multiple languages and bearing official seals that suggested royal authority. The dates he could make out ranged from the mid-14th century, and several mentioned land grants, mining rights, and sovereign authority over territories described in terms he didn't recognize, but which might refer to the hidden city itself. "Max, I think we're looking at the legal ownership documents for this entire place. The implications were staggering. If these documents were authentic, and if the legal principles they referenced were still valid, then Daniel and Max might have a legitimate claim to one of the most significant archaeological discoveries in modern history. The artifacts alone would be worth millions to collectors and museums. The historical significance was incalculable. But even as his mind raced with practical considerations, Daniel became aware of something else in the chamber, a presence that wasn't quite sound, wasn't quite vision, but somehow conveyed awareness and intelligence. The city itself seemed to be watching them, evaluating their intentions, deciding whether they were worthy of the trust being placed in them. Max felt it too, Daniel could tell. His son had grown very still, his head tilted slightly, as if listening to voices only he could hear. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a gravity that seemed beyond his years. "Dad, I don't think we found this place by accident. I think it was waiting for us." As if in response to Max's words, the crystal components throughout the chamber pulsed once in unison, their light growing brighter for just a moment before returning to its previous gentle glow. In that instant, Daniel felt something shift inside himself, a recognition that this discovery would change everything about their lives, and that there was no going back to the simple grief and loss they'd carried into these mountains. They stood in silence for several minutes, father and son surrounded by centuries of preserved history and faced with choices that would determine not only their own futures, but potentially the fate of this extraordinary place. The weight of responsibility was overwhelming, but for the first time since Sarah's death, Daniel felt something stirring in his chest that might have been hope. Among the documents in the vault, one leather-bound journal stood apart from the official papers. Its cover was worn smooth by handling, and the pages within were filled with careful handwriting in what Daniel recognized as medieval Latin mixed with vernacular phrases. Max, whose fascination with ancient languages had led him to study Latin through online courses, was able to translate portions of the text with growing excitement. "This is a record, Dad," Max said, his finger following the careful script. "Listen to this. In the year of our Lord 1347, the great mortality came to our lands like the wrath of God. Those who could flee did so, but we who remained chose sanctuary. In the hidden city of our fathers." Daniel leaned over his son's shoulder, watching as Max worked through the challenging text. The journal appeared to be a daily record kept by someone educated, perhaps a monk or scholar, who had witnessed the city's final days before it was sealed away from the world. Max continued reading, his voice growing more confident as he found his rhythm with the archaic language. Master Aldrich has completed the mechanism in the tower by which the city may be awakened when the time of trials has passed. We have gathered all our knowledge, all our wealth, that it might serve those who come after us with pure hearts. The implications were staggering. The city hadn't been abandoned due to war or natural disaster. It had been deliberately sealed as a refuge, preserved for future generations who might have need of its resources and wisdom. The mechanism Max had activated wasn't just an ancient device. It was a key designed to unlock the city's treasures when the right people arrived. As they read further, the journal revealed the story of a community that had faced the Black Death, sweeping across Europe and chosen to retreat into their hidden sanctuary rather than flee or perish. They had been guardians of knowledge and wealth accumulated over generations, and rather than let it be lost to plague and chaos, they had created a time capsule of medieval civilization. The children dream strange dreams, Max read, his voice dropping to a whisper. They speak of visitors from a distant time, a man who has lost his way, and a child who shall bridge the old world and the new. Perhaps these are mere fancies born of our isolation, but Master Aldrich believes the city itself whispers to those with the gift to listen. Daniel felt a chill run down his spine. The description was uncannily accurate to their own situation, a lost man and a child arriving in a time of personal crisis. He looked at Max, who had grown very still as he processed the implications of what he'd just read. "Dad, what if they knew we were coming? What if this whole thing was meant to happen?" Before Daniel could respond, they both became aware of a subtle change in the chamber's atmosphere. The crystal illumination had grown slightly brighter, and there was a warmth in the air that hadn't been there before. More unsettling, Daniel could have sworn he heard whispers, not loud enough to understand, but present enough to raise the hair on his arms. Max seemed less disturbed by these phenomena than fascinated. "Can you hear them too? It's like they're trying to tell us something." Daniel nodded reluctantly. His rational mind insisted that the sounds were simply the result of air currents moving through the ancient stone chambers. But another part of him, a part that had been awakening since they'd entered the city, recognized something more intentional in the whispers. They spent the rest of the afternoon exploring the journal's contents, piecing together the story of the city's last inhabitants. The writer, who identified himself as Brother Marcus, had been the community's chronicler and keeper of records. His entries revealed a sophisticated society that had blended practical knowledge with what they called the old wisdom, understanding of natural forces and spiritual matters that transcended simple religious doctrine. The final entries were particularly poignant. Brother Marcus described the decision to seal the city, explaining that the survivors had chosen to enter a state of preservation rather than wait for death from plague or starvation. They had performed some kind of ritual using the tower mechanism that would maintain the city in perfect condition while placing themselves in what he called the Great Sleep. "We go now to our rest," Max read from the journal's last page, "trusting that those who wake the city will prove worthy of the gift we leave behind. May they find in our sanctuary what we found here, refuge from the storms of the world and the wisdom to build something better from what remains." Daniel closed his eyes, feeling the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders like a physical presence. These people had trusted their legacy to unknown future visitors, and somehow that trust had fallen to him and Max. The question now was what they would do with it. As evening approached, they made their way back to the surface, both lost in their own thoughts about the day's revelations. The city's mysterious illumination had grown brighter as darkness fell, creating an otherworldly atmosphere that made every shadow seem alive with possibility. They set up their camping gear in the main square, using modern equipment that felt almost profane in the ancient setting. But as Daniel prepared their simple dinner over a portable stove, he noticed that Max seemed more animated than he'd been in months. His son was sketching in his journal, documenting the architectural details they'd observed and copying symbols. From the tower mechanism, "Max, we need to talk about what this means for us," Daniel said as they shared their meal. "This discovery is bigger than anything we could have imagined. It could change our entire future." Max looked up from his sketching, his expression serious beyond his years. "Are we going to tell people about it?" The question cut to the heart of Daniel's internal struggle. From a practical standpoint, the responsible thing would be to contact the Romanian authorities, report their discovery, and let proper archaeological procedures take their course. The artifacts alone were worth a fortune, and the historical significance demanded scholarly study. But another voice in his head, one that sounded suspiciously like Sarah, reminded him that some things were more valuable than money or academic recognition. This place had been preserved as a sanctuary, and there was something about it that spoke to broken souls seeking healing. "I don't know yet," Daniel admitted. "Part of me thinks we have an obligation to share this with the world, but another part wonders if that would destroy what makes it special." Max nodded thoughtfully. The journal talked about the city choosing its visitors. What if it's not meant for everyone? What if it's supposed to be a place where people like us can come when they need healing? Daniel looked at his son with renewed respect. At 9 years old, Max was grappling with philosophical questions that would challenge adults. But more than that, he seemed to understand instinctively what the city represented, not just a treasure to be claimed, but a trust to be honored. As they settled into their sleeping bags under a canopy of stars visible through the canyon opening, Daniel found himself thinking about the choices ahead. They could return to civilization, report their discovery, and probably become wealthy. From the finder's fees and book deals that would inevitably follow, Max would never want for anything, and Daniel could rebuild his architectural practice around the fame their discovery would bring. But they could also choose to keep the secret, at least for now. They could return periodically, learning more about the city's mysteries and perhaps finding ways to honor the original inhabitants' vision of sanctuary and healing. It would mean continuing to struggle financially, accepting his father's help and maintaining the facade of normal life while harboring an extraordinary secret. The whispers Daniel had heard in the vault seemed to follow them into the night, weaving through his dreams with images of the city's past and glimpses of possible futures. In his sleep, he saw Brother Marcus and the other final inhabitants, faces serene as they prepared for their great sleep. He saw the tower mechanism spinning through centuries of solitude, waiting patiently for the right moment to awaken, and he saw Sarah, standing in the city's main square, with sunlight streaming through her hair, smiling at him with the expression of someone who had found exactly what she'd been searching for. When he woke near dawn, her presence lingered so strongly that he looked around the square expecting to see her there. Max was already awake, sitting near the ancient well and writing in his journal. When he saw his father stirring, he closed the book and walked over. "Dad, I had the strangest dreams. I dreamed about the people who lived here, and they were trying to tell me something important. They said the city doesn't just preserve things, it heals them. It takes broken pieces and puts them back together, but better than they were before." Daniel sat up, studying his son's face in the early morning light. Max looked different somehow. More centered, more confident. The hollow look that had haunted his eyes since his mother's death had been replaced by something Daniel could only describe as purpose. "What else did they tell you?" "That we're not just visitors here. We're the bridge between what was and what could be. They've been waiting for people who understand loss, because only someone who's been broken can truly appreciate being made whole again." Daniel felt tears prick his eyes. Whether the dreams were real communication from the city's former inhabitants, or simply his son's remarkable intuition processing their extraordinary situation, the message resonated deeply. They had come to these mountains as broken refugees from grief, but somehow they had found something that offered the possibility of healing, not just for themselves, but perhaps for others who carried similar wounds. Looking around at the awakening city, its crystal lights pulsing gently in rhythm with some ancient heartbeat, Daniel realized that the most important decision of his life lay ahead. But for the first time in months, he felt ready to face that choice with wisdom rather than desperation. The morning brought new discoveries that challenged everything Daniel thought he understood about the boundary between legend and reality. While exploring the city's eastern quarter, they had found what appeared to be a medieval infirmary, complete with stone beds, carved channels for water, and alcoves that might have held medicinal supplies. The centerpiece of the chamber was an ornate chalice, crafted from silver that showed no tarnish despite its obvious age. The vessel was beautiful in its simplicity, elegant curves that felt perfect in the hand, with engravings that seemed to shift and change depending on the angle of observation. Max had been examining the chalice when he accidentally knocked it against a stone ledge, slicing a shallow cut across his palm. "I'm okay, Dad," Max had said quickly, seeing Daniel's concerned expression. But as he reached for the chalice to set it safely aside, something extraordinary happened. The cut on his palm, which should have required cleaning and a bandage, sealed itself completely within moments of touching the silver surface. Not only did the bleeding stop, but the skin knitted together without leaving so much as a scar. Daniel stared at his son's healed hand, his rational mind struggling to process what he'd witnessed. "Let me see that cut." Max extended his palm, which showed no trace of the injury that had been bleeding seconds before. The skin was smooth and unmarked, as if the accident had never occurred. Both father and son stared at the chalice with new understanding of what they might be dealing with. "Dad, do you think it's actually magic?" Max asked, his voice filled with wonder rather than fear. Daniel took the chalice from his son, turning it over in his hands. The metal felt warm to the touch, and he could swear he felt a gentle pulsing, like a slow heartbeat transmitted through the silver. "I don't know what to call it, Max, but I think we're beyond normal explanations for anything in this place." They spent the morning conducting careful experiments, documenting everything in Max's journal. The chalice seemed to respond to intent as much as contact. When Daniel deliberately scratched his own arm with a rough stone edge, simply holding the vessel with sincere desire for healing caused the wound to close immediately. But when they tried to test it casually, as if it were a mere curiosity, nothing happened. "It knows the difference," Max observed, with the matter-of-fact tone he used when stating obvious truths. "It only works when you really need it, not when you're just playing around." Daniel nodded, beginning to understand that the city's artifacts operated according to principles that had nothing to do with mechanical function and everything to do with the user's state of being. It was a humbling realization for someone trained in the concrete realities of engineering and architecture. As they explored further, they discovered that the healing properties were just one aspect of what the city offered. The water flowing through the restored channels was extraordinarily pure and seemed to have energizing properties that left them feeling more alert and refreshed than they'd felt in months. The air itself had a quality that made breathing deeper and more satisfying, as if it carried essential elements their bodies had been craving. But perhaps most significantly, Daniel realized that his chronic tension headaches, a constant companion since Sarah's diagnosis, had completely disappeared. The knot of stress that had lived between his shoulder blades for over 2 years was gone. Even his vision seemed sharper, as if a filter he hadn't known existed had been removed from his perception. Max was experiencing similar changes, though his were more emotional than physical. The withdrawn, cautious boy who had entered the mountains was being replaced by someone more confident and curious. He moved through the city with an ease that suggested he belonged there, as if some part of him had always known this place existed and was simply coming home. They photographed everything they could, though Daniel noticed that their digital camera seemed to have difficulty capturing the subtle luminescence that pervaded the city. The images came out clear enough to document architectural details and artifact positions, but they failed to convey the sense of aliveness that made the place so extraordinary. It was as if the city's essential nature resisted technological reproduction. By afternoon, they had filled 2 memory cards with images, and Max's journal was bulging with sketches and observations. Daniel's mind was racing with questions about legal ownership, historical significance, and practical concerns about preserving and protecting their discovery. But underlying all his practical considerations was a growing conviction that this place was meant to be more than a museum piece or academic study. "We need to go back to town," Daniel said finally, though the words felt wrong even as he spoke. "Them. We need to research property laws, check historical records, figure out what our options are." Max looked up from his sketching with an expression of disappointment. "Do we have to leave? I feel like we're just starting to understand this place." Daniel understood his son's reluctance. The city felt like a sanctuary in the truest sense, a place apart from the struggles and sorrows of the ordinary world. But practical reality couldn't be ignored indefinitely. They had responsibilities, limited resources, and a life waiting for them back in Chicago that couldn't be abandoned on a whim. "We're not abandoning it, Max. We're going to figure out the right way to handle this discovery. But that means understanding the legal situation and making sure we don't accidentally destroy something precious through ignorance." They spent their final evening in the city, sitting in the main square, watching the crystal lights grow brighter as darkness fell. The sense of presence Daniel had felt in the vault seemed stronger now, as if the city itself was aware of their impending departure and was trying to communicate something important. Max had been unusually quiet during dinner, staring thoughtfully at the tower mechanism they could see silhouetted against the stars. Finally, he spoke up with the serious tone that indicated he'd been wrestling with significant thoughts. "Dad, what if the reason Mom got sick wasn't just random? What if it was part of a bigger plan to bring us here?" Daniel felt his breath catch. The question touched on thoughts he'd been trying not to examine too closely. The series of coincidences and seemingly random events that had led them to this exact place at this exact time. Sarah's fascination with medieval history, her marked travel guides, even their financial struggles that had made this final trip feel necessary rather than indulgent. "I don't know if I'm ready to think about your mother's death as part of any kind of plan," Daniel said carefully. "It still hurts too much to look for meaning in losing her." Max nodded with understanding beyond his years. "I'm not saying it was good that she died. I'm saying maybe she knew somehow that we'd need to find this place. Maybe her love for us was strong enough to guide us here even after she was gone." The words hit Daniel like a physical blow, not because they hurt, but because they felt true in a way that bypassed rational analysis. He thought about Sarah's final weeks, how she'd insisted on organizing all their travel documents and making sure their passports were current, how she'd made him promise to take Max somewhere special after she was gone, somewhere they could remember that the world still held wonders worth discovering. "She did want us to take this trip," Daniel admitted. "Even when she was too sick to travel herself, she kept talking about the stories hiding in those mountains." Max leaned against his father's shoulder, the first spontaneous physical affection he'd shown since his mother's funeral. "Then maybe she's still taking care of us, just in a different way." They sat in comfortable silence for a long time, surrounded by the gentle luminescence of their impossible discovery. Daniel found himself thinking about the choices ahead, but for the first time in months, the future felt full of possibility rather than obligation. The next morning, they packed their gear with the reluctance of people leaving home rather than ending a camping trip. Daniel sealed the vault chamber using the tower mechanism, though he suspected the city would only reveal itself again to those it chose to trust. Max took one final set of photographs and made careful notes about their exact route through the canyon. As they reached the ancient gate where their journey had begun, the glowing butterfly that had led them to the city appeared once more. It circled around Max's head before settling briefly on his outstretched hand, its wings pulsing with the same rhythm as the city's crystal illumination. Then it flew back through the gate and disappeared into the depths of the hidden sanctuary. "It's telling us we can come back," Max said with absolute certainty. "This isn't goodbye, it's see you later." Daniel nodded, feeling the truth of his son's words resonate in his chest. They were leaving the city, but they were taking something precious with them, not gold or artifacts, but the knowledge that healing was possible, that broken things could be made whole, and that sometimes the most important discoveries were the ones that found you rather than the ones you sought. As they began their hike back to the marked trail, both father and son walked with lighter steps than they'd carried into the mountains. Behind them, hidden in its timeless canyon, the medieval city settled back into patient waiting, its secrets safe with those who understood their true value. The drive back to Bucharest felt surreal after their time in the timeless city. Modern highways, gas stations, and cell phone towers seemed almost offensive in their harsh functionality compared to the elegant integration of human habitation and natural beauty they'd left behind. Max spent most of the journey sketching from memory and asking Daniel technical questions about medieval construction techniques that neither of them could fully answer yet. Their first stop was the Romanian National Archives in Bucharest, where Daniel hoped to find historical records that might shed light on the legal status of their discovery. The elderly archivist, Dr. Elena Popescu, was intrigued by their inquiries about medieval settlements in the Carpathian Mountains and proved remarkably helpful in navigating the complex record system. "There are many legends about hidden cities. In our mountains," she explained in excellent English, pulling out maps that dated back centuries. "Most are dismissed as folklore, but some of our oldest documents reference places that were deliberately concealed during times of plague or invasion." Daniel studied the historical maps carefully, noting that none showed the specific canyon where they'd made their discovery. Even the most detailed surveys from the Habsburg period showed only empty wilderness in that area, as if the location had been somehow protected from official notice. Dr. Popescu was particularly interested when Max mentioned the architectural details they'd observed. Stone cities carved directly from cliffsides are rare, but not unknown in this region. However, the preservation you describe would be extraordinary. Most such settlements suffered severe damage over the centuries. After hours of research, they uncovered references to a place called Civitas Occulta, the hidden city, in several 14th century documents. The records were fragmentary, but they suggested a community that had been granted special autonomous status by a Hungarian king as reward for loyalty during a crucial military campaign. More significantly, they found a legal precedent that suggested ancient property rights might still be valid under Romanian law, particularly for sites that had been continuously maintained or occupied. If the documents in the city's vault could be authenticated, and if the legal chain of ownership remained unbroken, Daniel and Max might indeed have a legitimate claim to their discovery. But as they delved deeper into the research, another concern emerged. Several recent documents referenced increased mining and development interest in the Carpathian region, with multiple international companies filing exploratory permits for areas uncomfortably close to their hidden canyon. Tourism development as well, Dr. Popescu mentioned, showing them promotional materials for extreme hiking and adventure sports companies. The government is eager to attract visitors to remote areas that have been underutilized economically. Daniel felt a chill of apprehension. The isolation that had protected the city for centuries was increasingly under threat from modern economic development. If they didn't act to establish legal protection soon, their sanctuary might be discovered. by less sympathetic parties. Their next stop was a consultation with a Romanian attorney who specialized in historical property law. Mircea Antonescu was a sharp-eyed man in his 50s who listened to their carefully edited story with growing interest. "If these documents are authentic," he said after examining photocopies of some of the simpler legal texts they'd found, "and if the site can be definitively located and proven to match the descriptions, you could have a very strong claim." Romanian law recognizes certain categories of historical discovery rights, especially for sites that have been abandoned but maintained. The attorney explained the complex process of establishing legal ownership, which would require authentication of the historical documents, surveying of the property boundaries, and demonstration of the site's continuous preservation. The costs would be substantial, and the process could take years. More troubling was his warning about publicity. Once you file the initial claims, the discovery becomes public record. You would have no control over media attention, academic interest, or commercial exploitation. The site would be protected legally, but it would no longer be private. Daniel and Max exchanged glances, both understanding the implications. Legal ownership would provide security, but it would end the city's existence as a true sanctuary. Instead of a healing refuge, it would become a tourist destination, research facility, or museum. That evening, in their hotel room overlooking the Dâmbovița River, they called Daniel's father to update him on their trip. The conversation was carefully edited. They described beautiful hiking, interesting ruins, and a meaningful father-son bonding experience. But Daniel found himself reluctant to mention their most significant discovery, even to family. "You sound different, Daniel," his father observed near the end of the call. "More like yourself than you have since Sarah died." The comment caught Daniel off guard. He hadn't noticed the change in himself, but others apparently could hear it in his voice. The constant undertone of grief and exhaustion that had colored his words for months had been replaced by something that might have been hope. After ending the call, Daniel and Max spread out all their photographs and notes on the hotel bed, trying to make sense of everything they'd learned. The legal path was clear but problematic. The historical significance was undeniable but potentially destructive. The personal impact had been profound but difficult to explain to others. Max had been unusually quiet during the research process, absorbing information with his characteristic intensity. Now he looked up at his father with an expression of serious consideration. "Dad, what if we're thinking about this wrong? What if the question isn't whether we can own the city, but whether we're worthy to be its guardians?" Daniel paused in his note-taking. "What do you mean?" "Brother Marcus and the others didn't create that place as a treasure to be claimed. They made it as a refuge for people who needed healing. If we turn it into a legal case or a tourist attraction, we're destroying the thing that makes it special." The insight was remarkably mature, and it cut to the heart of Daniel's own conflicted feelings about their discovery. The city's value wasn't in its artifacts or historical significance. It was in its capacity to offer sanctuary and transformation to broken souls. "But we can't protect it if we don't have legal standing," Daniel pointed out, "and we can't keep it secret forever. Someone else will find it eventually." Max nodded thoughtfully. "Maybe that's okay, as long as it's the right someone. Maybe the city chooses its own visitors, and our job is just to make sure it stays safe for when they arrive." They spent hours discussing possibilities. They could establish some kind of foundation or trust to protect the site, while limiting access to those who genuinely needed its healing properties. They could work with sympathetic archaeologists and historians to study the city without destroying its essential nature. They could create a sustainable model that honored both the scientific significance and the spiritual sanctuary the original inhabitants had intended. But all of these options required resources they didn't currently possess, legal knowledge they were still acquiring, and a level of certainty about their own motivations that Daniel wasn't sure he could claim. As if sensing his father's internal struggle, Max reached into his backpack and withdrew something Daniel hadn't seen him take from the city. It was a ring, clearly ancient, made from gold that seemed to hold its own inner light, with a seal bearing symbols that matched those they'd seen throughout the hidden settlement. "Max, you can't just take artifacts from an archaeological site," Daniel said automatically, though his protest lacked real conviction. "I didn't take it, Dad. It was given to me." Max held up the ring, which fit perfectly on his index finger, despite being sized for an adult hand. "When I touched the crown in the vault, I felt something being placed in my hand. I think it's meant to prove our connection to the city." Daniel examined the ring more closely. The craftsmanship was extraordinary, and the symbols engraved in the seal were identical to those on the legal documents they'd found. If authentic, this single artifact could be worth hundreds of thousands of dollars to collectors. But more importantly, it might serve as proof of their legitimate claim to guardianship. "The ring of the city's protector," Max said with quiet certainty. "That's what the voice in my dreams called it. Whoever wears it has the authority to speak for the city and make decisions about its future." Daniel felt a familiar chill at his son's matter-of-fact reference to voices and dreams. But he was beginning to accept that Max's connection to the city operated on levels that defied rational explanation. If the place truly chose its own guardians, then perhaps a 9-year-old boy with an old soul and an architect's understanding of sacred spaces was exactly the right choice. The next morning brought a phone call that changed everything. Dr. Popescu from the archives contacted them with urgent news. A German archaeological expedition had filed permits to survey the exact region where their city was hidden, with excavation to begin within 6 months. "They are specifically looking for medieval settlements," she explained. "Someone has provided them with historical references that match the documents you showed me yesterday. I thought you should know." Daniel felt his stomach drop. Somehow, word of their discovery had leaked despite their careful discretion. Whether through the attorney, the archives research, or simple bad luck, their secret was no longer safe. "We have to go back," Max said immediately when Daniel shared the news. "We have to warn the city and figure out how to protect it." Daniel nodded, already making mental calculations about extending their stay in Romania. They would need to return to the canyon, document everything more thoroughly, and make some hard decisions about the future. The luxury of time to consider their options had just evaporated. As they checked out of the hotel and prepared for the drive back to the mountains, Daniel reflected on how completely his life had changed in just 1 week. 7 days ago, he had been a grief-stricken widower, planning to surrender his independence and move in with his estranged father. Now he was the unlikely guardian of one of history's most significant archaeological discoveries, racing against time to protect a sanctuary that had already begun healing wounds he'd thought were permanent. Max sat beside him in the passenger seat, the ancient ring catching sunlight as he sketched new plans in his journal. His son had found his purpose in life at age 9, and Daniel was beginning to understand that his own purpose might be to help Max fulfill that calling. The mountains ahead looked different now, not like the wilderness escape they'd sought a week ago, but like home territory that needed defending. Behind them, Bucharest faded into the distance, with its complications of law and politics and academic ambition. Ahead lay a hidden canyon where time moved differently and broken souls could be made whole again. Whatever challenges awaited them, Daniel knew they would face them together, guided by ancient wisdom and sustained by love that transcended even death. The ring on Max's finger pulsed gently with its inner light, a reminder that some responsibilities chose their bearers rather than the other way around. The return journey to the hidden canyon felt different from their first hike. Where they had once moved with the casual pace of tourists, they now traveled with the urgency of protectors returning to defend their sanctuary. Max led the way with confidence that surprised Daniel. His son moved through the forest as if following invisible markers that only he could see. They reached the city as afternoon shadows were lengthening across the main square. The moment they stepped through the ancient gate, Daniel felt the familiar sense of homecoming wash over him, but underlying that comfort was a new awareness of vulnerability. This place that had remained hidden for 7 centuries was now under threat, and the responsibility for its protection rested largely on their shoulders. Max immediately headed for the tower, climbing the spiral stairs with purpose. Daniel followed, wondering what his son hoped to accomplish with the ancient mechanism. At the top, Max approached the device that had awakened the city during their first visit, but instead of activating it, he simply stood quietly with his hands resting on the crystal components. "What are you doing?" Daniel asked softly. "Listening," Max replied without opening his eyes. "The city is worried. It knows strangers are coming, people who won't understand what this place really is." Daniel had stopped questioning his son's apparent ability to communicate with their discovery. The evidence of Max's connection was too clear to dismiss, and frankly, they needed whatever advantage his unusual sensitivity could provide. After several minutes, Max opened his eyes and turned to his father with an expression of grave responsibility. "Dad, the city wants to show us something important. We need to go to the highest tower, the one we haven't explored yet." Daniel looked through the windows at the tallest spire rising from the city's eastern wall. They had avoided it during their earlier explorations because the entrance appeared to be blocked by fallen stones. But as they descended from the bell tower and approached the structure, Daniel realized that what he had taken for debris was actually a carefully constructed barrier designed to look like natural collapse. Max approached the false blockage and pressed his hand against a specific stone, the royal seal ring glowing faintly as it made contact. With a soft, grinding sound, the barrier shifted aside to reveal stairs leading upward into darkness. The climb was longer and more challenging than the bell tower ascent, but the crystal illumination that had activated throughout the city provided enough light to navigate safely. At the top, they found themselves in a circular chamber that took Daniel's breath away. The room was dominated by an enormous mirror that seemed to be made from polished silver rather than glass. Its surface rippled slightly, like still water disturbed by a gentle breeze, and looking into it, Daniel saw not his own reflection, but something far more extraordinary. The mirror showed the city as it had been in its prime, bustling with activity, filled with people going about their daily lives. But more than that, it showed the city's potential future, with restored buildings and new inhabitants who had come seeking the same healing and sanctuary that he and Max had found. "It's the mirror of truth," Max said, approaching the artifact. With respectful caution, Brother Marcus wrote about it in his journal. "It shows not what is, but what could be if people make the right choices." Daniel stepped closer to the mirror, watching as the images shifted to show different possibilities. In one vision, he saw the city overrun with tourists and researchers, its sacred atmosphere destroyed by commercial exploitation. In another, he saw it abandoned and forgotten again, its treasures scattered to private collectors and museums around the world. But the vision that held his attention showed something more hopeful. He saw the city restored and protected, serving as a refuge for people who had suffered loss and needed a place to heal. Families, individuals, scholars and seekers arrived in small groups, staying long enough to find what they needed before returning to the world with renewed purpose. In this vision, he saw himself older and more peaceful, working alongside Max to maintain the city and guide its visitors. He saw his father there too, his relationship with Daniel healed by their shared commitment to something greater than their past conflicts. Most remarkably, he glimpsed Sarah, not physically present, but somehow part of the city's spirit, her love and wisdom woven into the sanctuary she had unknowingly helped them find. Max was having his own vision, and Daniel could see tears streaming down his son's face. "What do you see?" Daniel asked gently. "I see Mom," Max whispered. She's here, Dad. She's part of this place now. She says she guided us here because she knew we could protect it and help other people the way it's helped us. Daniel felt his own tears falling as he looked deeper into the mirror. Sarah's presence was subtle but unmistakable, a warmth that pervaded the images, a sense of approval and love that surrounded every positive possibility the mirror showed. But the visions weren't just wishful thinking. The mirror also showed them practical information about the challenges ahead. Daniel saw the German archaeological team arriving with heavy equipment, intent on excavating the city for academic study. He saw lawyers and government officials arguing over ownership rights, while treasure hunters and black market dealers circled like vultures. More troubling, he saw that news of the discovery was already spreading beyond academic circles. Social media posts, leaked documents, and rumors were drawing attention from people whose interests were far from pure. The window of opportunity to establish proper protection for the city was rapidly closing. "We need help," Daniel realized. Aloud, "We can't protect this place by ourselves," Max nodded, wiping away his tears, "but we have to be careful who we trust." The mirror shows that some people who claim to want to help will actually destroy what makes the city special. They spent hours studying the mirror's visions, trying to understand which paths led to preservation and which to destruction. Gradually, a plan began to emerge. They would need to act quickly to establish legal protection, but they would also need to find allies who understood the city's true value. The mirror showed them potential supporters: a Romanian historian named Dr. Christina, Moldovan who had spent her career studying medieval sanctuaries, a wealthy philanthropist in Switzerland who funded historical preservation projects, and surprisingly, Daniel's own father, whose engineering background and business connections could prove invaluable in navigating the complex challenges ahead. As evening approached, they made their way back to the main square to set up camp once again, but this time they weren't alone. As they prepared their dinner, other figures began to materialize in the plaza, translucent and shifting, but unmistakably present. Brother Marcus appeared first, the scholarly monk whose journal had told them so much about the city's history. He was joined by other medieval inhabitants, including Master Aldrich, the craftsman who had created the tower mechanism, and a woman in elegant robes who might have been the community's leader or healer. Max seemed unsurprised by these manifestations, greeting them with polite nods as if encountering ghosts was a perfectly normal part of city life. Daniel found the experience more unsettling, but gradually accepted that the preserved inhabitants were simply another aspect of the sanctuary they had committed to protecting. Through gestures and impressions rather than words, the ghostly figures communicated their approval of Daniel and Max's guardianship. They also conveyed urgency about the approaching threats and offered guidance about which artifacts and knowledge would be most important to preserve if the city were discovered by hostile forces. Brother Marcus approached the royal seal ring on Max's finger, touching it briefly with his translucent hand. Immediately, Max's eyes widened with new understanding. "They're giving us the complete history," Max explained to his father. "Not just what's in the journal, but everything. All the knowledge they preserved, all the wisdom they learned about healing and sanctuary." Daniel felt a weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders, unlike anything he'd ever experienced. They weren't just protecting an archaeological site, they were serving as bridges between centuries of accumulated wisdom and a modern world that desperately needed what this place offered. As the ghostly inhabitants faded back into whatever realm they normally occupied, Daniel and Max sat by their camp stove, sharing a simple meal that felt like a communion with history itself. Tomorrow would bring difficult decisions and dangerous challenges, but tonight they were exactly where they needed to be, surrounded by the gentle luminescence of their impossible sanctuary and strengthened by love that transcended even death. The City's crystal lights pulsed in rhythm with their heartbeats, reminding them that they were no longer merely visitors to this place. They had become part of its living story, guardians of its future, and bridges between worlds of loss and healing. The discovery came at dawn, when Max was exploring chambers they hadn't yet fully investigated. Daniel woke to his son's excited voice echoing from somewhere deep within the city's residential quarter, calling for him to come quickly. Following the sound, through narrow passages carved directly from the living rock, Daniel found Max standing before what appeared to be a solid wall covered in the familiar symbols they'd seen throughout the city. "Dad, look at this," Max said, holding up a crystal key he'd found among the artifacts in the vault. "It fits right here, in this indentation." Daniel examined the wall more carefully and realized it wasn't solid at all, but rather an incredibly sophisticated door mechanism. The symbols weren't just decorative, they were part of an intricate locking system that required both the physical key and knowledge of the proper sequence to operate. Max inserted the crystal key and began touching symbols in a pattern that seemed to come to him intuitively. As each symbol was activated, it began to glow with the same gentle luminescence that pervaded the rest of the city. When the final symbol was pressed, the entire wall began to rotate on a central axis, revealing a chamber beyond that, defied. Everything Daniel thought he understood about the city's nature, the room they entered wasn't carved from stone like the rest of the settlement. Instead, it appeared to be constructed from the same crystal material as the illumination system, creating surfaces that seemed to exist somewhere between solid matter and pure light. More unsettling, the chamber felt enormous, far larger than should have been possible given the city's external dimensions. "This isn't just a room," Daniel realized aloud. "This is something else entirely." Max nodded, moving deeper into the crystal space with confident steps. "It's the heart of the city. Dad, the place where time works differently." As if responding to Max's words, the chamber began to shift around them. The crystal walls displayed images, not static carvings or paintings, but moving scenes that showed the city's history unfolding in real time. Daniel watched, mesmerized, as centuries compressed into moments, showing the construction of the settlement, its flourishing period, the arrival of plague refugees, and finally the great ritual that had preserved everything in temporal stasis. But the most shocking revelation came when the images shifted to show recent events. Daniel saw himself and Max arriving at the city, but from a perspective that suggested the chamber had been watching them from the moment they entered the canyon. More than watching, the images showed the city actively influencing their journey. From the appearance of the glowing butterfly to the subtle manipulations that had led them to discover each new chamber and artifact. "We didn't find this place," Daniel said, the full implications hitting him like a physical blow. "It found us." The crystal walls pulsed in what seemed like confirmation, and new images appeared showing other visitors throughout the centuries. Daniel saw people from different eras arriving in times of great personal crisis, plague survivors, war refugees, those fleeing persecution or grieving profound losses. Each group had been drawn to the city by the same mysterious guidance that had led Daniel and Max to their discovery, but the most startling revelation was yet to come. As the images continued to unfold, Daniel realized that the city didn't just preserve its inhabitants in temporal stasis, it existed simultaneously across multiple time periods. The ghostly figures they'd encountered weren't memories or spirits, but the actual inhabitants of the settlement, living in a parallel temporal stream that occasionally intersected with normal time. "That's why the city never decayed," Max said with matter-of-fact understanding. "It's not really abandoned. The people are still here, just living in a different layer of time." As if summoned by his words, Brother Marcus materialized in the crystal chamber. But unlike his previous translucent appearances, he now seemed solid and real. He smiled at Daniel and Max with warm recognition, speaking in accented but clear English. Welcome to the Eternal City, Guardians. We have been waiting for you to discover this final chamber where past, present, and future converge. Daniel stared at the monk in shock. You're really here? You're actually alive. Alive in one sense, preserved in another, Brother Marcus replied. When the great mortality threatened our community, Master Aldrich created something far more sophisticated than a simple sanctuary. He created a place where time itself could be shaped to serve human need. The monk gestured to the crystal walls, which began displaying new images showing the construction of the temporal mechanism. Daniel saw medieval craftsmen working alongside, figures whose clothing and tools suggested they came from other historical periods entirely. The city hadn't just preserved one community, it had become a refuge across time, collecting knowledge and wisdom from multiple eras. Every person who finds their way here brings something valuable, Brother Marcus continued. Your architectural knowledge, young Max's intuitive understanding of our mechanisms, even your grief over Sarah's death, all of it becomes part of the city's growing wisdom. Max stepped forward, the royal seal ring glowing brightly on his finger. Are we supposed to stay here forever like you did? The monk shook his head with gentle amusement. The choice is yours, young guardian. Some visitors remain to help maintain the sanctuary across time. Others return to their own era to serve as bridges between worlds. But all who truly find this place are changed by it, and all remain connected to its purpose. Daniel's mind reeled, with questions and implications. If the city existed across multiple time periods, then the threats he'd worried about, the archaeological expedition, government interference, commercial exploitation, might be less significant than he'd feared. A place that controlled its own temporal flow could simply shift away from unwanted attention. But Brother Marcus seemed to read his thoughts. The city's temporal defenses are not unlimited, Daniel. They require conscious guidance from those who understand both the old knowledge and new challenges. This is why guardians are chosen, to help the sanctuary navigate the complexities of changing times. The crystal chamber began to shift again, showing visions of possible futures that were both more hopeful and more complex than anything Daniel had imagined. He saw the city serving as a refuge across multiple historical periods, offering sanctuary to those fleeing various catastrophes throughout human history. He saw himself and Max learning to move between temporal streams, serving as guides and protectors for visitors from different eras. But he also saw the dangers that lay ahead. The modern world's technological capabilities posed unprecedented threats to the city's secrecy. Satellite imagery, ground-penetrating radar, and other advanced detection methods could potentially pierce the veils of time and mystery that had protected the sanctuary for centuries. The German expedition is just the beginning, Brother Marcus warned. Your era's hunger for knowledge and profit will not be easily deterred. The city needs guardians who understand both worlds, the ancient wisdom and modern challenges. Max stepped up to one of the crystal surfaces, placing his hand flat against its luminescent face. Immediately, the chamber filled with new images, showing the full extent of the city's temporal network. Daniel saw connections stretching across centuries, linking the medieval settlement to other sanctuaries and refugees throughout history. It's not just one city, Max realized aloud. It's a whole system of safe places, all connected through time. Brother Marcus nodded approvingly. Now you begin to understand the true scope of your guardianship. This place is a nexus in a network of sanctuaries that has existed since humans first needed healing and wisdom. Your role is not just to protect one site, but to help maintain connections across the entire temporal web. Daniel felt the weight of this revelation settling on his shoulders like a mantle of sacred responsibility. He had thought he was simply protecting an archaeological site, but instead he was being called to serve as a guardian of something that transcended normal concepts of time and place. The crystal walls began to show him practical information. how to activate the city's temporal defenses, how to guide visitors safely between different time streams, how to maintain the delicate balance that kept the sanctuary stable across multiple eras. The knowledge flowed into his mind with the same gentle inevitability as the city's healing had flowed into his wounded heart. Max was receiving his own education, learning to read the symbols and operate the mechanisms that controlled the city's various functions. Daniel watched his son absorb centuries of accumulated wisdom with the natural ease of someone who had been born to this role. "The choice approaches," Brother Marcus said, as the images began to fade. "The German expedition will arrive within days. You must decide whether to reveal yourselves as the city's guardians or allow it to shift away from this time period until the danger passes." Daniel looked at his son, seeing not a 9-year-old child, but a young guardian coming into his power. Max met his father's gaze with steady confidence, and Daniel realized that whatever they decided, they would face it together as partners in an ancient calling that had found them across the barriers of grief and time. The crystal chamber pulsed once more, and Daniel felt the city's patient presence surrounding them both, waiting for their decision, but confident in their wisdom. They were no longer lost refugees seeking healing. They had become guardians of healing itself, protectors of a sanctuary that existed outside normal time and inside the human heart's deepest need for hope. The sound of helicopters reached them on the morning of the 3rd day after their revelation in the crystal chamber. Daniel and Max stood on the city's highest wall, watching as 2 aircraft circled the canyon like mechanical vultures, their rotors echoing off the limestone cliffs in a harsh contrast to the sanctuary's eternal quiet. Through binoculars borrowed from their camping gear, Daniel could make out the markings on the larger helicopter, a German archaeological foundation with ties to several major European universities. The smaller aircraft bore no obvious identification, but its occupants were photographing the canyon walls with professional equipment that suggested commercial rather than academic interest. "They know exactly where to look," Daniel observed, grimly. "Someone gave them very specific coordinates." Max nodded, his young face troubled but determined. The royal seal ring on his finger had grown brighter since their time in the crystal chamber, pulsing with an inner light that seemed to respond to his emotional state. Now it glowed with steady intensity, as if preparing for the confrontation ahead. Brother Marcus had appeared beside them without sound, his form more solid in daylight than Daniel had yet seen. The monk's expression was grave as he watched the circling aircraft. "They bring powerful tools," he said quietly. "Ground-sensing devices that can penetrate stone, equipment that maps structures hidden from normal sight. The old protections may not be sufficient against such methods." Daniel felt the weight of decision pressing down on him. In the crystal chamber, Brother Marcus had shown them the city's temporal defenses, the ability to shift the entire sanctuary into a different time stream, making it effectively invisible to unwanted visitors. But using those defenses would mean abandoning this time period, potentially forever. What happens to people who need the city's healing if we hide it from the modern world? Max asked, voicing Daniel's own concerns. "The sanctuary has hidden." "Before," Brother Marcus replied, "during the Ottoman invasions, through the religious wars, when Napoleon's armies swept through these mountains. Each time, it emerged when the danger passed. But your era presents unique challenges. Your technology advances faster than our ability to adapt our protections." The helicopters completed another pass, then flew north toward what Daniel recognized as the trailhead where he and Max had parked their rental SUV. Within hours, the expedition would arrive on foot with their equipment and begin a systematic search of the canyon. Daniel made his decision with the certainty of someone who had finally found his true purpose. "We don't hide. We stand and fight for this place, brother." Marcus studied Daniel's face with ancient eyes that had seen centuries of human struggle. "You understand what you risk. If you reveal yourselves as guardians, you assume responsibility not just for this sanctuary, but for maintaining the entire network of refugees across time. There can be no retreat from such a calling. I understand, Daniel replied, and he did. The broken man who had entered these mountains seeking a final father-son adventure had died somewhere along the way, replaced by someone who knew his life's work wasn't building structures of glass and steel, but protecting spaces where broken souls could be made whole. Max stepped up beside his father, the ring's glow intensifying until it cast visible light in the morning shadows. "We're ready." Brother Marcus smiled with approval and pride. "Then let us prepare. You will need all the city's knowledge and power to face what comes." The next several hours passed in intensive preparation. Brother Marcus and other ghostly inhabitants guided Daniel and Max through the city's most important chambers, teaching them to activate defensive mechanisms that had been dormant for centuries. Daniel learned to manipulate the crystal illumination system, using it to create barriers and diversions. Max discovered that his connection to the city's temporal aspects allowed him to shift small areas in and out of normal time flow, creating spaces that couldn't be detected by conventional instruments. Most importantly, they retrieved the Guardian's staff from its resting place in the highest tower. The artifact was clearly ancient, but felt warm and alive in Daniel's hands. Made from a wood that shouldn't have been able to survive centuries of storage, inlaid with crystal elements that matched the city's illumination system, the staff served as both a symbol of authority and a tool for channeling the sanctuary's power. "The staff chooses its bearer," Brother Marcus explained, as Daniel adjusted his grip on the unexpected weight. "It has waited 700 years for someone with both the knowledge to understand its purpose and the will to use it wisely." Daniel felt the truth of those words resonate through the staff and into his bones. This wasn't just a responsibility he was accepting, it was a calling he had been moving toward his entire life, guided by forces he was only beginning to understand. By afternoon, they could hear voices echoing up from the canyon floor. The expedition had arrived and was setting up base camp just outside the city's natural concealment. Daniel and Max positioned themselves on the wall above the ancient gate, watching as teams of researchers and technicians assembled equipment that looked like something from a science fiction film. Dr. Wolfgang Brenner, the expedition leader, was a thin man in his 50s whose intensity suggested someone who had spent his career chasing archaeological fame. His team included specialists in ground-penetrating radar, 3D mapping technology, and historical documentation, exactly the tools needed to strip away the city's mysteries and reduce its magic to academic data. But it was the second group that troubled Daniel more. Led by a woman in expensive outdoor gear who carried herself with corporate authority, they were clearly representatives of commercial interests. Their equipment focused on resource assessment and extraction planning rather than historical preservation. "Treasure hunters," Max said with distaste, echoing Daniel's own thoughts. The academic and commercial teams maintained polite cooperation while setting up their camps. But Daniel could sense the underlying tension. Both groups wanted the city's secrets, but for very different purposes. Neither understood what they were truly seeking to exploit. As evening approached, the expedition teams began their preliminary surveys of the canyon walls, using handheld devices to scan for hidden structures. Their technology was indeed impressive. Several times, Daniel watched their instruments detect void spaces and structural anomalies that corresponded exactly to the city's location. "They'll find the entrance by tomorrow morning," Daniel told Max as they watched from their concealed position. "Once they breach the outer defenses, they'll see everything." Max nodded, his hand resting on the royal seal ring. "Then we meet them. At the gate, we show them who we are and what this place really means." Daniel felt pride swell in his chest at his son's courage. At 9 years old, Max was prepared to stand against trained professionals and defend a sanctuary that existed beyond their comprehension. But Daniel also felt the terrible weight of knowing that this confrontation could go badly wrong. Brother Marcus appeared beside them as the expedition teams settled into their camps below. "There is another choice," the monk said quietly. "The city could choose them as it chose you. Some among their number might prove worthy of the sanctuary's gifts." Daniel considered this possibility, studying the people below through his binoculars. Dr. Brenner was driven by academic ambition, but Daniel could see genuine passion for history in his movements. Several of the younger team members showed the kind of wonder and respect that suggested they might understand the city's true nature. Even among the commercial group, there were individuals who seemed more interested in preservation than exploitation. The team leader might be focused on profit, but some of her subordinates carried themselves with the reverence appropriate to a sacred site. "The city will test them," Max said with quiet certainty, "just like it tested us. Some will see the treasure and want to take it. Others will see the sanctuary and want to protect it." Daniel nodded, understanding that their role as guardians wasn't to keep everyone away from the city, but to ensure that only those with pure intentions gained access to its deepest secrets. The confrontation ahead wasn't just about defending territory. It was about evaluating hearts and guiding souls toward healing or away from harm. As stars began to appear overhead, Daniel and Max made their final preparations. They gathered essential artifacts, activated the city's most important defenses, and positioned themselves to control access to the sanctuary's inner chambers. The Guardian staff hummed with power in Daniel's hands, while the royal seal ring on Max's finger pulsed in rhythm with the city's crystal illumination. They were as ready as they could be for the challenge ahead. Tomorrow would determine not just the fate of their hidden sanctuary, but their own transformation from grieving refugees into true guardians of an ancient trust. In the expedition camps below, lights flickered as researchers prepared for what they expected to be the discovery of their careers. None of them yet realized that the greatest treasure in the hidden city wasn't gold or artifacts, but the possibility of healing wounds that went deeper than any archaeological survey could map. The night passed slowly, filled with the quiet preparations of people on both sides who understood that morning would bring changes none of them could fully predict. Daniel dozed fitfully, the Guardian's staff warm in his hands and Sarah's presence somehow near, while Max slept peacefully with the confidence of someone who knew he was exactly where he belonged. Dawn was only hours away, and with it would come the test that would determine whether the Sanctuary of Centuries would survive to heal another generation of broken souls. The crown of Avalon appeared to Daniel in a dream just before dawn, floating above the altar in the city's chapel with a radiance that seemed to emanate from beyond the visible spectrum. In the dream, he heard Sarah's voice clearly for the first time since her death, not as memory or wishful thinking, but as direct communication across the boundary between worlds. "The crown chooses the true guardian," she said, her words carrying love and certainty. Not the one who seeks power, but the one who understands that real authority comes from service to something greater than oneself. Daniel woke with tears on his face and absolute clarity about what needed to happen. The confrontation ahead wasn't about fighting off intruders. It was about revealing the city's true nature to those who might prove worthy of its trust, while protecting it from those who would exploit or destroy its essential purpose. Max was already awake, sitting beside the window that faced the expedition camps below. In the pre-dawn light, Daniel could see teams of researchers preparing their equipment for what they clearly expected to be a systematic exploration of the hidden structures their instruments had detected. "They found the entrance," Max reported, quietly. Dr. Brenner's team located the exact spot where the gate opens. They're setting up drilling equipment to break through what they think is just a rockfall. Daniel joined his son at the window, watching as the archaeological team positioned powerful tools that could easily breach the city's outer defenses. But more concerning was the commercial team's activity. They were deploying equipment that suggested they planned to begin extraction operations immediately after the site was opened. "Time to go," Daniel said, lifting the Guardian's staff. The ancient weapon hummed with power, its crystal inlays pulsing in sync with the city's illumination system. Max slipped the royal seal ring onto his finger, and immediately both artifacts began to glow more brightly, as if recognizing each other's presence. They made their way through the city's quiet streets to the main gate, where Brother Marcus and several other ghostly inhabitants had already gathered. The medieval figures looked more solid in the early light, and Daniel realized that the approaching confrontation was drawing them more fully into the present time stream. "They will see us," Brother Marcus warned. "Once the city reveals itself, there can be no hiding our continued existence. Your world will have to accept that some things transcend normal understanding of life and death." Daniel nodded, accepting this final responsibility. As guardians, he and Max would have to bridge not just the gap between the city and the modern world, but between conventional reality and the deeper truths that the sanctuary embodied. The sound of drilling equipment echoed off the canyon walls as Dr. Brenner's team began their assault on what they perceived as a blocked entrance. Daniel could feel the city's distress at this violation, transmitted through the Guardian's staff as a low vibration that made his teeth ache. "Now," Max said with quiet authority, and Daniel realized his son wasn't asking permission, but stating a recognition of the right moment. Together they stepped through the ancient gate and emerged into view of the expedition teams. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The drilling stopped, voices fell silent, and dozens of researchers and technicians stared in shock at the medieval city that had simply materialized before their eyes. But it was Daniel and Max themselves who commanded the most attention. The Guardian's staff blazed with light in Daniel's hands, while the royal seal ring on Max's finger cast a golden radiance that made the child appear far older and more regal than his 9 years should have allowed. Dr. Brenner was the first to recover from the shock, stepping forward with the careful movements of someone who understood they were witnessing something unprecedented. "My God," he whispered, his academic composure cracking. "How is this possible?" Daniel raised the Guardian's staff, and its light intensified until everyone present could see not just the city's physical structures, but the ghostly figures of Brother Marcus and the other preserved inhabitants standing in the gateway behind them. "This city has been waiting," Daniel said, his voice carrying clearly across the canyon, "not for discovery, but for those who understand what it truly offers." The commercial team leader, a sharp-eyed woman named Helena Cross, pushed forward, with less reverence than greed. "Whatever this is, it belongs in a museum. The historical value alone belongs to no one," Max interrupted, his young voice carrying an authority that made the adults present step back involuntarily. "This place chooses its own guardians and protects those who need healing," as if responding to Max's words. The crown of Avalon began to materialize above their heads, floating in the morning air with the same ethereal beauty Daniel had seen in his dream. The artifact pulsed with inner light, and everyone present could feel its power, not as something to be claimed, but as a test of worthiness. Dr. Brenner approached slowly, his eyes fixed on the crown with scholarly fascination rather than acquisitive. "Hunger, the craftsmanship is extraordinary," he murmured. "The historical implications." The crown descended toward him, hovering just within reach. But as the archaeologist extended his hand, the artifact pulsed once and withdrew, as if evaluating his intentions and finding them insufficient. Helena Cross stepped forward next, her corporate instincts recognizing the crown's obvious value. But before she could even reach toward it, the artifact flared with warning light and moved away from her entirely. One by one, members of both teams approached the floating crown, each drawn by their own motivations: academic glory, financial gain, professional advancement. But the Crown of Avalon rejected them all, sometimes gently, sometimes with clear disapproval that left the rejected parties stumbling backward. Finally, a young graduate student named Eleanor approached with different energy entirely. Daniel could see in her face the same expression of wonder and reverence that he'd first felt upon discovering the city. As she neared the crown, it began to glow more warmly, responding to something in her heart that the others lacked. "I can feel it," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "It's not just an artifact, it's alive with the love of everyone who ever found sanctuary here." The crown of Avalon settled gently onto Elena's head, and immediately she was transformed. Not physically, but in some essential way that made her seem to belong to the city as much as to the modern world. The ring on Max's finger pulsed in recognition and welcome. "We have our first new guardian," Max announced with satisfaction. But Helena Cross wasn't finished. Frustrated by her rejection by the crown, she signaled to her team to begin setting up extraction equipment anyway. Mystical nonsense aside, this site represents millions in recoverable artifacts. "We have legal permits to survey this area." Daniel stepped forward, the Guardian's staff blazing with protective power. "Your permits don't extend to places that exist outside normal time and space. This sanctuary has its own sovereignty, earned through centuries of service to those in need." The confrontation escalated as Helena's team moved toward the city gate, with equipment designed to breach and catalogue the settlement's treasures. But as they approached, the ghostly inhabitants became more solid, forming a line of medieval guardians that no amount of modern technology could simply push aside. Brother Marcus stepped forward, now fully materialized in the morning light. "You seek treasure, but you find only what your hearts can comprehend. Those who come in greed will leave empty-handed. Those who come in need will find healing beyond measure." The crown of Avalon on Elena's head began to pulse more rapidly, and Daniel realized that the young woman's acceptance as a guardian was triggering changes throughout the city. Ancient mechanisms were awakening, temporal defenses were strengthening, and the sanctuary was preparing to fully reveal its true nature to those present. The climactic moment was approaching, the point where the city would either accept this mixed group of visitors as worthy of its trust, or reject them entirely and shift away from the modern world until humanity proved ready for what it offered. The Book of Names materialized on the ancient altar in the city's chapel just as Helena Cross made her final desperate attempt to claim the sanctuary's treasures by force. The massive tome appeared with a sound like distant thunder, its leather binding unmarked by age and its pages glowing with the same gentle luminescence that pervaded the city. Elena, wearing the crown of Avalon, felt the book's presence immediately. "The record is opening," she announced with newfound authority, her voice carrying across the canyon. "All who stand in this place will be inscribed according to their true intentions." Daniel watched as golden script began to appear on the book's open pages, writing itself in languages both ancient and modern. Names were being recorded, but not simply as a visitor registry. The book was documenting each person's deepest motivations and their fitness to know the city's secrets. Dr. Brenner's name appeared first, surrounded by text that acknowledged his genuine love of history, but noted his hunger for academic recognition. The book marked him as worthy of knowledge but requiring guidance in wisdom. Several of his team members received similar notations, individuals whose scholarly interests were pure enough to grant them limited access to the city's historical treasures, but whose understanding remained primarily intellectual rather than spiritual. Helena Cross's name appeared in darker script, surrounded by warnings about her exploitative intentions. But even as the book recorded her unsuitability as a guardian, it noted that her organizational skills and business connections could serve the city's protection if properly directed. More surprising was the notation that appeared beside several members of the commercial team. The book revealed that some who had come seeking profit were actually driven by deeper needs: financial desperation to care for sick family members, desire to prove themselves worthy of respect, or simple longing to be part of something greater than themselves. As each name was inscribed, the person experienced a moment of profound self-recognition. Some were humbled by seeing their motivations laid bare. Others were elevated by understanding that their intentions were purer than they had realized. Young Eleanor's name blazed with golden light as it appeared, surrounded by text that confirmed her role as a bridge between the academic world and the city's deeper mysteries. The crown of Avalon pulsed in recognition of the book's validation, but it was when Max approached the book that the most extraordinary inscription occurred. As his small hand touched the ancient pages, his name appeared not in contemporary script, but in the same medieval calligraphy used throughout the original records. Beside it, Brother Marcus's notation read, "The child of two worlds, born to this calling, heir to guardianship across time." Daniel's own inscription was equally significant. The builder of bridges, wounded healer, protector of sanctuaries. But it was the final line of his entry that brought tears to his eyes. Guided by love beyond death, chosen by Sarah of the eternal light. As the last names were recorded, the book began to glow more intensely, and Daniel realized that something fundamental was happening to everyone present. The city wasn't just evaluating them, it was offering transformation to those willing to accept it. Helena Cross felt her corporate ambitions melting away, replaced by understanding of the sanctuary's true value. Instead of seeing extraction opportunities, she began to envision protection strategies, legal frameworks that could preserve the city while allowing controlled access to those who needed its healing. Dr. Brenner's academic hunger evolved into deeper wisdom as he recognized that some knowledge was meant to be experienced rather than simply catalogued. His expertise would serve not to exploit the city, but to help others understand its historical context and significance. The graduate students and researchers found their perspectives expanded beyond narrow specializations as they grasped the interconnectedness of history, spirituality, and human need that the sanctuary represented. Even the commercial team members discovered new purposes as they realized their practical skills could serve something more meaningful than profit margins. But the most profound transformation was happening to Daniel and Max themselves. As their names solidified in the Book of Names, father and son felt the full weight and joy of their guardianship settling into their bones. They were no longer refugees from grief. They had become architects of healing, protectors of a sanctuary that existed to mend broken souls. Brother Marcus approached the altar, his form now completely solid and real. "The inscriptions are complete," he announced. "All who stand in this place have been evaluated and found capable of growth. The city accepts this generation as worthy of its trust." The book's pages fluttered in a wind that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, revealing that the tome contained thousands of names spanning centuries. Every person who had ever found true sanctuary in the hidden city, from medieval plague survivors to modern refugees from various forms of suffering. Elena looked up from where she knelt beside the altar, the crown of Avalon catching the morning light. "We're part of something ancient and eternal," she said with wonder. "This place doesn't just preserve history, it creates it by transforming everyone who enters." With open hearts, Helena Cross, her corporate aggression replaced by protective determination, stepped forward. "What do you need from us? How do we help protect this place and make sure it can continue its work?" Daniel smiled, recognizing in her question the same shift from self-interest to service that had transformed his own life. "We build a new kind of foundation," he said, "one that serves the city's purpose while protecting it from those who would exploit or destroy its essential nature." Max nodded eagerly. "We create a bridge between the old wisdom and the new world. Some people will come here for healing, others will help maintain the sanctuary, and still others will go back to the world as guardians of similar places." The plan that emerged over the following hours was ambitious, but grounded in practical wisdom. Dr. Brenner would lead a carefully selected team of researchers in documenting the city's historical significance without violating its sacred aspects. Helena would establish legal and financial structures to protect the sanctuary from unwanted attention while funding its preservation. Elena would serve as the bridge between academic study and spiritual understanding. Most importantly, the city would continue to function as it always had, as a refuge for those who needed healing, a place where broken souls could be made whole, and a sanctuary that existed partially outside normal time to serve human need across the centuries. As evening approached, the expanded group of guardians gathered in the main square for what Brother Marcus called the Blessing of Names. The ceremony was simple but profound. Each person whose name had been inscribed in the book pledged to serve the city's purpose according to their abilities and understanding. The ghostly inhabitants of the sanctuary became visible to all present, no longer translucent figures, but fully realized people whose centuries of preservation had been vindicated by the arrival of worthy successors. The city itself seemed to pulse with new life, as ancient and modern guardians joined in common cause. Daniel stood with the guardian staff glowing warmly in his hands, looking around at the faces illuminated by the city's eternal light. Max was beside him, the royal seal ring marking him as heir to a guardianship that would span his lifetime and beyond. Elena wore the crown of Avalon with dignity that made her seem far older than her graduate student years, but it was the transformation in everyone present that moved Daniel most deeply. A group of strangers, united only by accident, had become a community dedicated to something greater than themselves. Grief and greed had been transformed into purpose and protection. The sanctuary had not only survived its discovery, it had grown stronger by welcoming new guardians who understood its true value. As the stars appeared overhead, shining down through the canyon opening onto a city that existed in multiple times. Simultaneously, Daniel felt Sarah's presence more clearly than he had since her death. She was part of this place now, woven into its eternal purpose of healing and hope. The Book of Names continued to glow softly on the altar, its pages recording not just individual transformations, but the birth of a new chapter in the sanctuary's endless story of offering refuge to those who needed it most. 1 year later, Daniel stood in the same spot where he and Max had first glimpsed the impossible city, but everything had changed in ways that went far deeper than the visible improvements around them. The eternal flame now burned openly in a crystal brazier at the center of the main square, its light visible to anyone who approached with genuine need for healing or sanctuary. The city itself had evolved into something unprecedented in the modern world, a place where ancient wisdom and contemporary knowledge worked in harmony to serve human healing. The residential quarters had been carefully restored using traditional techniques, guided by Brother Marcus and the other preserved inhabitants, while modern amenities had been integrated with such skill that they seemed to grow naturally from the medieval architecture. Max, now 10, and carrying himself with the quiet authority of someone who had found his true calling early in life, led a group of visitors through the outer chambers. These weren't tourists or academics, but people who had been drawn to the sanctuary by the same mysterious guidance that had once brought a grieving father and his son to this hidden canyon. The city chooses its own guests, Max was explaining, to a war veteran struggling with trauma and his wife, who had been caring for him through years of difficult recovery. You didn't find this place by accident. Something in your hearts called to it, and it responded by clearing a path for you, to arrive exactly when you needed to be here. Daniel smiled, watching his son work with visitors with the same natural empathy that Brother Marcus had shown them during their own first encounters with the city's mysteries. Max had grown not just in age, but in wisdom, becoming a bridge between the sanctuary's ancient purposes and the needs of contemporary souls seeking healing. The changes in Daniel were equally profound. The broken architect who had entered these mountains, planning to surrender his independence, had become something he'd never imagined. A builder of bridges between worlds, a protector of sacred spaces, and a healer of wounds that went deeper than physical injury. His relationship with his father had been transformed by their shared commitment to the sanctuary. Robert Morrison had visited 3 months earlier, initially skeptical about his son's radical life change, but quickly recognizing the profound healing that had occurred in both Daniel and Max. The older man had ended up staying for 2 weeks, using his engineering expertise to help design sustainable infrastructure systems that honored the city's timeless character while serving modern needs. "You found your purpose, son," Robert had said, before returning to Milwaukee. "Sarah would be proud of what you've built here." The sanctuary now operated under a unique legal framework that Helena Cross had developed with support from international historical preservation organizations and several philanthropic foundations. The city existed as a protected cultural site with special autonomy, allowing it to serve its healing function while maintaining the privacy and spiritual atmosphere essential to its work. Dr. Brenner led a small research team that studied the city's historical significance without intruding on its sacred functions. Their published papers had revolutionized understanding of medieval preservation techniques and temporal anomalies, while carefully protecting the location and specific methods that kept the sanctuary hidden from casual discovery. Elena had become the sanctuary's primary interpreter, helping visitors understand the connection between historical preservation and personal healing. The Crown of Avalon had evolved into something like a doctoral hood of ancient wisdom, marking her as someone who could translate between academic knowledge and spiritual insight. But it was the steady stream of people who found their way to the city seeking healing that validated the Guardian's work most powerfully. Veterans dealing with trauma, families grieving loss, individuals recovering from addiction, people facing terminal illness, all discovered that the sanctuary offered something no conventional therapy or medical treatment could provide. The healing wasn't magical in any supernatural sense, but it was transformative in ways that defied easy explanation. The city's atmosphere of timeless peace, combined with the wisdom of guardians who had themselves been healed by the place, created conditions where deep wounds could finally begin to mend. Daniel often thought about the mechanisms behind the sanctuary's power. The crystal illumination system seemed to respond to human emotional states, providing subtle environmental cues that promoted calm and reflection. The preserved knowledge of medieval healers, combined with Brother Marcus's centuries of understanding human suffering, offered insights that complemented modern psychological and medical approaches. Most significantly, the city's existence outside normal time allowed visitors to step away from the urgent pressures of contemporary life and gain perspective on their struggles within a larger context of human endurance and hope. The eternal flame that burned in the main square had become a focal point for the sanctuary's deepest work. Visitors were invited to sit near the flame and share their burdens with guardians who understood that listening was often more healing than advice. The fire's light seemed to draw out stories that people had never been able to tell, allowing them to transform private pain into shared understanding. On this anniversary morning, Daniel found himself drawn to the flame as he reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment. Sarah's presence was woven throughout the sanctuary now, not as a ghostly visitation, but as an integral part of the city's healing spirit. Max joined him beside the crystal brazier, and together they watched the eternal flame dance with patterns that seemed to reflect the stories of everyone who had ever found sanctuary in this place. "Do you miss our old life?" Daniel asked his son, though he already knew the answer. "Sometimes I miss Mom being physically with us," Max replied thoughtfully, "but I can feel her everywhere in this place, and I know that what we're doing here is what she would want us to be doing, Daniel nodded, understanding that their loss had been transformed into a source of strength for others facing similar grief. The sanctuary didn't erase pain or pretend that suffering wasn't real, but it provided a context where even the deepest wounds could become sources of wisdom and compassion. Brother Marcus appeared beside them, his form now permanently solid after a year of renewed purpose. "The morning visitors are arriving," he reported. "A family whose daughter died in an accident, an elderly man whose life partner passed after 60 years together, and a young woman dealing with survivor's guilt from a military deployment." Daniel and Max exchanged glances, both recognizing the familiar pattern of people being drawn to the sanctuary exactly when they most needed what it offered. "We'll meet them at the gate," Daniel said, lifting the guardian's staff that had become as natural in his hands as any architect's tool he'd ever wielded. As they walked toward the ancient entrance where their own transformation had begun, Daniel reflected on how completely his understanding of success and happiness had changed. A year ago, he had measured his life in terms of professional achievement and financial security. Now he understood that true wealth lay in the ability to offer sanctuary to others, and in the knowledge that broken things, including broken hearts, could always be made whole again. The canyon that had once seemed like a place of exile now felt like the center of the world, a nexus where people from across time and space could find what they needed to continue their journeys with renewed hope. The medieval city that had preserved itself across centuries had become a bridge to the future, proving that the human need for sanctuary, healing, and transformation was as eternal as the flame that burned at its heart. As the morning sun illuminated the ancient stones and crystal lights of their impossible home, Daniel Morrison walked beside his son toward whatever souls might be approaching through the mist, carrying the knowledge that some discoveries find their finders, and some destinies are written in languages deeper than grief, but no less powerful than love. The eternal flame burned on behind them, its light promising that as long as human hearts could break, there would always be places where they could heal, and as long as people sought sanctuary, there would always be guardians ready to welcome them home.